All right. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jiaqi Ma. I'm an engineering professor at UCLA. I also serve as the director of the Center of Excellence on New Mobility and Automated Vehicles, the Mobility COE. So if this is your first time you join us, this is our Mobility COE webinar series. And if you haven't heard about Mobility COE, so here, let me give you a quick introduction. So the Federal Highway Administration enters into a cooperative agreement with UCLA last October to establish the Mobility COE as defined in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So the purpose of the Mobility COE is to collect, conduct, and fund research on the impacts of mobility technologies, new mobilities, shared services, and highly automated vehicles deployed at scale, and their impact on land use, urban design, transportation, real estate, equity, municipal budgets, and so on. So, and if more information, please go to our website, mobilitycoe.org, for more information. And this is the second webinar of a webinar series, which occurs bi-monthly, with each focusing on very specific topics that I identified with our internal research team as research gaps. Information of each webinar will be posted on our website, LinkedIn pages, and distributed via our mailing list. So please subscribe via our website, follow our LinkedIn page for updates if you're interested. All right, now a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. Note that the webinar is being recorded, and the recording and a summary of the webinar, which is a white paper for this discussion today, will be available on the Mobility COE website for your reference, not long after today. Please note that all participants, except the panelists, will be muted in the beginning, the first maybe 40 to 45 minutes during the webinar where the panel discussion happens. But after that, we will leave 10 or 15 minutes so each of you can request unmute or raise hands so we can unmute you so you can directly engage with the panelists to ask your questions that you're interested in. You can always using the Q&A functions in the Zoom to type your questions. So all of us will be keep an eye on the questions that you type in real time, and we'll be try our best to weave your questions into our discussions today. But they will also for sure be addressed at the end of the webinar. All right, that's all for the housekeeping. Now I'm excited to start. Today we're focusing on this very important topics. Is the road ahead for highly automated vehicle integration into our existing transportation mobility systems, particularly from a city's perspective. Now, this webinar will explore challenges and opportunities AVs present from a system safety all the way to different broader implications for citywide. We are bringing together a panel of esteemed city and agency managers who have been working directly with AV at scale deployments in two different states with quite different regulatory environments. And they will share their insights, best practices, and lessons learned. And I will prompt them to share with us their wish lists too in the future about automated vehicle deployments. I hope we will be able to dive into details that kind of rarely discussed about this topic so far. So, okay, now, first important thing is to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, I would like to introduce Jean-Paul Valles. He's a principal planner and AV policy lead for San Francisco County Transportation Authority. Prior to joining SFCTA, Jean-Paul has held positions focused on leveraging mobility innovations with California Air Resources Board, King County Metro, and World Bank. Jean-Paul, thank you for agreeing to be with us today. And then the second panelist is Rachel Castiglione. She is a senior business process consultant in the City of Austin. She leads the Austin's Autonomous Vehicle Working Group and supports all of Austin's emerging mobility technology, including commercial drone delivery and connected infrastructure in a smart mobility office. She's an attorney, avid cyclists, great, and also proponent of safe and equitable mobility systems. Thank you for having to being with us today. Also, last but not least, um, Kim Williams. She is the Chief Innovation Officer of Metropolitan Transit Authority for Harris County in Houston, Houston Metro. She led Metro's autonomous vehicle proving ground program, launched AV circular services at Texas University. And most recently, she also launched phase 2 of the Metro's AV program, Metro's Future Link. Kim also worked very closely with the Federal Transit Administration in deploying these new technologies, such as through their Accelerating Innovative Mobility grant. Also, Kim is one of our steering committee members, so I invited Kim to be here, be a knowledgeable panelist for sure, but also kind of represent our steering committee to talk with our panelists today. All right, great. Thank you so much for having you, Kim, and all other two panel members to be with us today. All right, enough for my opening remarks. So I would like to dive directly into these questions and hear our speakers, panelists, their insights. Now, I will just start with a relatively easy question. So I look at the list here. I can recognize some of the names, some of my friends from academia and so on. The first question is I would like to share your experiences with AV deployment. So AVs, we see like Waymo Cruise has been increasing their deployment in a couple of cities, right, including yours as well. But in many other cities, people are still not waiting for AVs to be at their city. But I would like you to give us an introduction about the deployment of AVs at scale deployment in your cities, and just about who is deploying there, and also importantly, what kind of issues you have encountered. There might be very good scenarios that say AV saved lives, but also there might be scenarios that you think AV performance lacking, and you may share with us what potential issues you think that are. This will serve as a foundation of our discussion and help the audience to understand, the whole deployment environment. All right, maybe Jean-Paul, I will start with you with the San Francisco.
Hey, thank you, Yashi, and thank you all for having me here. It's an honor to be here. Yeah, I mean, I guess quickly, like the overview would be who is deploying in San Francisco. I think we can speak of, again, Waymo. We had Cruise, and they have their permits currently suspended. We also have Souks, and I guess we learned recently that May Mobility has also received a permit from the California DMV. I think that's to work, I guess, broadly throughout California, so not specific to SF, but I guess maybe that's a quick way of painting the picture. And most of these services are being deployed in the kind of robotaxi manner. SFCTA also kind of led a small kind of AV shuttle pilot in Treasure Island, but I think that's not necessarily the focus, or I think some of my colleagues today may be able to speak more in more detail today with regards to other kind of shuttle experiments. And I guess in this kind of quick approach to the question, I would say that, yeah, AVs and particularly Waymo and Cruise had been operating in San Francisco for a number of years. And I would say that for the most part, the experience on the road as you see them is that they follow the rules of the road and interact appropriately with other road users. And to me, that is a huge success. I guess if you're asking of huge success versus some failures, that still strikes me as a very, exceptionally positive outcome to see cars without drivers that are just kind of managing the road just fine. So yeah, I don't take that for granted. But of course, especially for those that kind of track some of these news are wonky about AVs, that I think we're all aware of the various instances here in San Francisco where performance has been lacking. So here, most notably, we had the October 2nd incident where a pedestrian was severely injured. We've had a number of other crashes of different levels of severity. We also have had various incidents in which AVs have obstructed first responders from attending emergencies, transit operations, and kind of general traffic flow. So yeah, I guess that would be kind of like my kind of quick summary. And I guess I'll add to this that it's hard to speak in a more systematic way about AVs and kind of talk about impacts or how well are they doing or how well they are not doing, because again, we don't have access to any kind of data that will allow us to make those assessments, right? So I think it all sounds very anecdotal because that's really kind of the only tools that we have available right now. And so I guess probably end there. Yeah, pass it to my colleagues.
Yeah, thank you. Rachel, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. So I'm Rachel. I work for the city of Austin, Texas. It's nice to be here with all of you. We have 6 autonomous vehicle companies, either in testing, mapping, or deployment in Austin. Waymo and Cruise are among them. Cruise has currently suspended operations here in Austin. We do not have a regulatory environment like California. There is no authority in Texas who can stop anyone who wanted to do an AV deployment. We anticipate that changing in the upcoming legislature, which will be the January 25 legislature. We anticipate, coming into a more regulatory program. But right now, cities, as well as TxDOT, have no power to do any regulatory work around AVs. So Cruise, Waymo, Zoox, Motional, as well as Volkswagen, ADMT, and AV Ride. And, things began ramping up here after San Francisco. So we were thinking like last summer, we really began getting a lot of feedback from our community and our first responders about experiences they were having with AVs on the streets of Austin. Now, Austin is really a different city than San Francisco. Has much wider roads. It's much less dense. It's more similar to Phoenix, where there's a very large Waymo deployment as well. So, the first thing we did was call San Francisco. Some of you on this call were one of my first calls, and Phoenix, to kind of determine what kind of procedures and policies we should have in a system where we have no regulatory authority. We created a one-pager of our expectations as a city, and that really is about getting in the way of first responders, right? Because the autonomous vehicles don't always recognize lights and sirens the way that you and I would, or the way that we're taught to, at least. So that was a struggle we had, just like San Francisco, but we have wider streets. So we didn't, I think, quite have it to the level that San Francisco had it. We did have, a lot of citizen feedback about privacy. That was a really big concern. We struggled to find the charging infrastructure for everyone who wanted it, right? A really big fleet requires a really large amount of electricity. Autonomous vehicles tend to use more electricity than a regular EV would. So, making sure that everyone had access to our public charging system while not displacing people who needed to use them. So finding that balance, again, in a situation where we have no regulatory authority, no one has to come through us in the city of Austin. We do maintain a dashboard. It is on our website. Someone from my team can put a link in the chat to it. Of all the incidents that come in about it. And I think as the fall went on and as, these issues kept building up, we did build some good relationships with people about really where we were finding bad situations. Any situation, like especially big events where there's a lot of pedestrians in the right of way, ends up being a situation that's hard for regular drivers too, right? Not just autonomous drivers, but regular drivers. And for us, that was the University of Texas football. That football stadium is right in downtown Austin. We have a lot of events in downtown Austin, including Austin City Limits, South by Southwest. They bring in a lot of people. The right-of-way changes, the way we use it changes. These caused issues. And when we see incidents occurring in the same spot again and again, we do take action. That's kind of our feeling, is just risk reduction. So we do everything we can to reduce risk, and that includes asking people, not to kind of stay away from campus during those football games, really working through how to act around fire stations, right? The most likely place to see a fire truck is near a fire station because they're coming or going. So really we worked through with some AV partners on how they could be better, like corporate citizens of Austin, where we're seeing the issues again and again and why, and how we fix them. Because I think it's easier to prevent issues, prevent like autonomous vehicle issues in the right of way than it is to fix something, that's already kind of reached a crisis point. So we're really focused on identifying places where AVs are struggling and then like thinking through how we work through it together, whether that's creating a no-go zone for autonomous vehicles. And San Francisco, ourselves and Phoenix do have a 911 exclusion zone where our 911 calls are being communicated, and we're asking them to put up an exclusion zone around our highest priority ones. But also like situations in which our striping and our signage, like could use help and could use, some refreshment. And that's the kind of thing that helps both drivers and autonomous vehicles. So we're trying to move forward with an idea of how do we make the right of way safer for all users, including people who are in autonomous vehicles, including people who are drivers, including especially vulnerable road users. And how do we use the data, the very little data we get from autonomous vehicles, to tell us about how our right of way is operating, what the risks are. So that's a little about Austin.
Yeah, thank you. We'll come back to many of the issues you just discussed. But I'll go ahead and let Kim introduce what's happening in Houston.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, and appreciate being a part of the conversation today. So I am coming at it from the perspective of the Public Transit Agency, and we are a separate agency from the City of Houston. Our interest in autonomous vehicles was really looking at, as Rachel mentions, Texas has one of the most unrestrictive laws in the country on autonomous vehicles. So we knew that they were coming to Texas, and we knew that they would be in our operating environment. So our initial thought was to look at the technology and how it might interact with the 1,300 vehicles we have operating throughout the region. And then it went from that perspective to, well, what would it look like to operate an AV in the transit fleet? And so that is where a lot of our work is focused. And in that process, we have developed relationships with some of the other providers in our environment. So I'll start with them and then move to our projects in particular. But our initial AV provider in the area in the city of Houston was actually Neuro. Neuro is a grocery delivery company that uses autonomous vehicles in their delivery service. And they've operated in Houston now for several years, uneventfully as far as we know. We did do a partnership with them during the pandemic, where they have a partnership with a particular grocery store here. And during the pandemic, there were patrons who would normally use our paratransit service, but weren't comfortable going out. And so we partnered with Neuro to have them make those deliveries for that customer. So that was our first experience with the private sector providers of AV service. And I know that's delivery versus passenger movement, but that was our first experience in Houston. So following that, most recently, Cruise came to Houston, and they started doing their testing in around the Houston area in several high density neighborhoods throughout Houston without much public engagement. They just kind of went out, the cars were out. They're very noticeable cars because of the equipment on them. And so people started to ask and wonder, and really have some concerns, and felt that there should have been more conversation and dialogue. And so similar to Austin, Cruise has discontinued operations in Houston, but they have been responding to some of the concerns raised and bringing on a safety officer and meeting with transit. In their testing mode, we did have some interaction with them as far as interaction with our transit fleet, as well as we have our own police force, so Metropolitan Police Department. When we were doing high participation events down throughout the downtown area. So those are kind of our private sector interactions. As far as Houston Metro goes, we are actually on our second AV project. Our first one was a closed loop project on a university campus. And that went very well. And now we're expanding that to mixed traffic for first and last mile use. In the particular uniqueness, if you will, of our use cases, it's in a underserved community. So you get to test out the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation and how that looks with autonomous vehicles. We also have interaction with an active light rail line, as well as interaction with other high capacity transit in that particular test zone. So that has been our experience to date. And like Rachel, we're waiting to see what private sector providers do in the area, and then also what legislation might look like when our legislature, which meets every other year, meets this coming January.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. I think you touched on a couple of points in my second question, so let's just dive into it. So it's about how AVs and existing transportation systems can be integrated. You mentioned that you're doing projects, you're looking at Houston, how cruises came into Houston and but I believe in other places too, right? They're not doing much public engagement. And also but from a transit agency perspective, you're looking at integration with your existing vehicles. What do you think is the relationship, right, between the AVs? Now they're sort of deployed as a robo-taxi, right? That's how we call it in the media. And then with the multimodal transportation system, how that is being a part of it? Are they interacting? Do you think they were interacting well or complement the existing transit systems or become competitors, right? Because many years ago when Uber, Lyft came, right? Those shared ride-hailing industry. Initially, they solved the problem with inefficiency of taxi industry, but then they become a competitor to some extent to transit systems. So, can you the panelists, can you share some insights on that end? Maybe Kim, I will just start from you and reverse order.
No, I think that is a great point, and you're absolutely right as far as the perspective of the public transit agency and how we reacted to Uber and Lyft when they first came into the market. But what I always remind people is that public transit has coexisted with other modes of transportation for a long time. I mean, there's always been, the taxis in New York. There's been other light rail, subway systems that have always coexisted. And I think there's very few places you can go that you're not dealing with congestion. And so I think you need everything in the toolbox. So I do not see it as competitive. I see it as a supplement. I see it also as an opportunity. And you're starting to see transit agencies who are using AVs to supplement parts of their fleet, particularly for first and last mile applications. And that's how we're using it. And then you also see in Houston in particular, we don't have a taxi company. We have a few small providers, but we don't have that city taxi company. They actually went out of business during the pandemic. And so I think there is a role to play on the AV robo-taxi side that does not compete with transit. Sure, there'll be some shaving of a public transit customer here and there, but I think overall, again, we've coexisted for many, many decades, and I don't see that being different. I on the opportunity side, as I mentioned, first and last mile applications, but you're also starting to see AVs in the yard and operational and maintenance piece as well. So I think we learned a lot from the Uber and Lyft experience to maybe not necessarily see this as competitive, but to really think and look through how we can leverage this technology in a more beneficial way and how to leverage it in public transit.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to hear Rachel and Jean-Paul's opinion on this, but I will add a sub question to this because you mentioned first mile, last mile. I think that's one of the greatest use case of AVs, robo taxis, and in how they're connecting to the backbone transit systems. However, if you're looking at how the robo taxi company deploying, right? They're not really deploying initially for a first mile, last mile purposes, and when they expanding the deployment, I mean that doesn't seem to me it's a factor has been considered to really complement transit systems, right? Because as they're expanding gradually, as we see in San Francisco and maybe Austin, so that's kind of questions that plague me a lot. But I will hear maybe Sean, Paul, and Rachel. Can you share some insights on that?
Sure. So I think that, like as cities and as counties, we want people to get to where they're going in an accessible, safe, and sustainable manner. And so the accessibility of robot taxis is price-wise, I think, closer to an Uber and Lyft ride than most of our transit. And I will say, when I went to ITS last month, I took a Waymo from the airport and I took the light rail back to the airport. And it was literally just a matter of time of day convenience, right? Like it was late at night coming in and it was the middle of the day going out. So, but that's just my experience. We want people to have a lot of options so that they can take the option that works for them and their families and their lifestyle. So we're definitely not against rideshare, whether it be autonomous or not. But for first mile, last mile for us, we are beginning a very big light rail project in Austin. We will have light rail. We passed a bond in 2020. Construction will begin very soon. On top of that, we are expanding our highway. Not we, TxDOT is expanding our highway through the middle of Austin. So we are experiencing what we call like a twin construction right through downtown Austin, which is, of course, Austin's like a pretty centralized city. So we do want to engage with the AVs, and we have spoken to them about how they can help us solve for this extremely difficult construction crisis that's coming up in Austin for the next few years. As the highway expands, we are planning to cap the highway. So we will build caps over I-35 going through downtown Austin. And we add 14 miles of light rail throughout the city, along with bus rapid transit. So, to the extent that they want to support and help transit, and they have said that they do. I know Volkswagen in Germany has a fairly large public transit system that's like autonomous. We would love to kind of partner on how we get people across the city, which is historically segregated, how we get people to and from places in this construction situation. I don't think they're competitors because I think people should have as many options as they can have, and people should be empowered to make those decisions themselves on how they want to get around.
Great, thank you. And Sean, Paul, any insights from you?
There we go. Sorry. Long way to unmute. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe perhaps also on kind of setting the context to contrast with my colleagues in California, we do have kind of like a regulatory framework. AV deployments are regulated by the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, and then the California Public Utilities Commission, where it refers to specific to passenger services. But local governments do not have any regulatory tools themselves. And so that's a little bit of the challenge to manage these deployments that actually happen on our roadways, but we really don't have any kind of tools to do so. I think, on the question of how are they integrating, I guess my sense is that besides what I already described, which is that they seem to already kind of like manage kind of general operations on the road just fine. We're still just seeing kind of that performance tracks with that technology that has made, again, incredible strides through, again, simulations and testing and piloting. But once they kind of scale into full-on kind of deployment and driverless deployment, it is an adjustment to really kind of like, adjust to that reality of a fully kind of complex environment throughout the city, and again with the kind of restrictions of kind of road size and density that we have here in SF. And so what we see to some degree seems natural in terms of, again, adjusting. But again, also apologies for repeating myself, it's just hard to speak of that in a systematic way. It's just hard to actually say to what level is that adjustment kind of like we're seeing a progress or lagging, because again, the data is not readily available to say that in a more confident way. Perhaps to engage with the question of competitiveness or how to integrate, I guess, like in general, the potential is readily available, is there in terms of kind of like, as my colleagues were saying, providing kind of new modalities to our kind of ecosystem. Here in San Francisco, we have a transit first policy. And so again, we also kind of favor kind of transit, walking, biking, and what we think are more sustainable modes or more efficient ways of getting around, and again, what is a rather restricted right of way. And so yeah, so there's a potential, but I guess that the question is, how does one realize that potential? And so, Yachi, you're bringing the example of TNCs, and it's fair in the sense that, you know, like AVs are operating mainly here in San Francisco in TNC like capacity, and so the question is, are we to expect similar contributions to the overall mobility system from AVs that we have seen from TNCs? And so I guess just as a reference point, we know here in San Francisco that, again, you know, TNCs have broad improvements in terms of, again, providing mobility at certain times of the day or certain geographies where the solutions were not readily available. The same for folks that don't have access to a private car. But they also increased congestion in San Francisco in a significant way. Uber and Lyft combined contributed to 50% of the increase in congestion in SF from 2010 to 2016 for some of our research. And similarly, they took away ridership from these sustainable modes. Like from, again, some of our research, we found that nearly 50% of TNC trips in San Francisco had shifted from walking, biking, or transit, or the trip would not have happened in the first place. So again, RAV is going to replicate this. Again, we're talking in the case of TNCs and the numbers that I'm sharing with regards to a fleet of 6,000 TNCs versus, again, a much more limited for the moment fleet of AVs. But I think some of those negative impacts are the ones that we are now aware of, and I think we would like to develop tools to better manage and kind of channel in a different direction.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned all these different aspects and, you know, particularly how potentially there might be some negative impacts on congestion, including vehicle miles traveled, VMT, and so on. You know, just one thing, right? The mobility COE is all about unintended consequences that this new technology may be bringing to our existing systems, and about what is the prevention or mitigation strategies we can deploy right before these technology deploy at scale. So this is kind of one of the central themes of our mobility COE. And just one shameless plug that our team did a research in the Southern California area, did a very detailed 2-year project modeling efforts. We did estimated 9.6% increase in VMT with a good amount of AV deployment, at-scale deployments. So that's something that we have talked with our MPO, and they all kind of agreed with the results, and they basically said now it's time to deploy, you know, prevention mitigation strategies right before they really increase the VMT. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Okay, now
can I ask you a question then, Yachi, maybe to kind of flip the tables a little bit?
Sure.
Or those figures that like incorporating like the difference between kind of private AVs versus kind of just this fleet model that we have, or how does that play out?
Yeah, I'm glad you're reversing the conversation. So yeah, what we did is actually a shared AV service plus a personally owned AV. So we have these two types of AVs in there because we believe in the future it kind of will coexist in the system. Somebody will using robotaxi just like today, how they're deploying, but somebody will own AVs, right? Great. Yeah. All right. It's about you, not about me today, so I'll continue. So now it's a difficult question. Maybe it's easy to answer. It's about the regulatory environment, regulatory gaps. And many, I think both Jean, Rachel, and you mentioned that there's no basically much regulatory power the local have, right, in terms of AV deployments. But maybe you can still talk about kind of a idealistic but still realistic scenario with this regulatory environments. What are the regulatory gaps? What can we possibly do, or what is being done in this area? Because we're talking about the cruise incidents, right? We waited until cruise incidents to happen, and then we suspended their operations. And then, so what are the regulatory gaps here that we can permit their initial deployment, and also importantly, their expansions? right? So these are all different stages of deployment. And related to this question, I just putting a very complicated question is about data, right? Rachel mentioned you need data with the limited data that you have, and you're dealing with AVs on your streets. But what are the data that you currently have, and what will be the ideal situation you think that this data sharing, data exchange can happen to enable a very kind of systematic way of of ensuring safety of AV deployment and expansion? Maybe Rachel, I'll start with you.
Sure. So we are very lucky in that we are involved in the regulatory process, both at the federal and state level. We have worked with NHTSA and other folks at federal rulemaking. We're really in touch with our Congress people about what we need, like what we need to have a safe mobility system with autonomous vehicles. So, I mean, again, we don't have any regulations now, and that is a choice that the Texas legislature made in 2017 before we really had AV deployment. So what we want to see is we want to have a really clear way to do citations. We have figured out a way to do citations, but it's only with the partnership of the AV companies. And, it's really unclear, how do you hold a robot responsible? Is a huge ethical, legal, and technical question. So we play a small part in that. Regulatorily, we would really like to see, proof of safety. Again, anyone can operate in Texas, which means we've got some really big names, huge OEMs, and we have foreign companies coming in, and then, it could be companies we've never heard of as well. We don't have any ability to look at the quality, to look at any safety information, or to regulate where they are. They can go anywhere a vehicle that's driven can go. The difference is a vehicle that's being driven, it's easier to move around a 911 system or a 911 call or emergency call. It's easier to kind of block. It understands human traffic control. That's a real struggle we've had, as well as San Francisco, is when you have a police officer directing traffic, how the vehicle interacts with them. So we would like to, put limits on where and when, I think time and place limits on when they're operating, just so that we can make sure that we're being really safe. I think as a city, we believe that AVs can be a real possibility in a safer mobility system. But we're living in a laboratory right now. So anything that we can. What we'd really like is data, though. And I think that that's kind of what you're getting at. The data in my dashboard, which is in the chat, is entirely created by the people of Austin: firefighters, police officers, citizens calling in, residents. Yesterday, I saw a Waymo in a commercial loading zone for over an hour, and it just happened to be that I was walking to get coffee, right? So we're creating our own data because NHTSA has a data system, and it does not share location data or date data with us, so it's not useful to us. Texas has no data system, unlike California, which is getting some, but not a lot of data on incidents. But a collision is not the only incident we care about. We care about ignoring a police officer. We care about, blocking. There's a famous San Francisco situation of blocking an ambulance. We care about, stopping mid-traffic. So we're collecting data from our people, but we would love to know vehicle miles traveled. We'd love to know speed during incidents. We would love to, even have collisions. And I think that the industry has a fear of admitting any wrong, but we're only going to move forward together if we're really honest about this isn't perfect yet. We're working on it. How do we work together on it? So, if I had a dream regulatory environment, we would the state of Texas would get more information from the AV companies and share it with us. We would be able to identify places where we can make infrastructure safer, or put in connected infrastructure, or places where autonomous vehicles shouldn't be because they're not ready to be there yet. And we would have the power to, make it so, and the authority to close them off from, say, the University of Texas campus or whatever. So that's my regulatory and data dream list.
I see. So just double check. So the data you have shared in the chat box is created by your perspective, your site, right? Different agencies. not from any data from AV companies.
Yep.
Okay, so Jean-Paul or Kim, anything to add to?
Kim, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I would just say I echo what Rachel mentioned about data. As I mentioned, our earlier interest was in understanding how these vehicles will interact with our fleet. And so there are certain human behaviors we see, and we're curious if those carry over to the AV space. For example, because our buses make a number of stops along the curb, we have a situation where we have a higher number of rear ends accidents than other types of vehicles. Well, does that happen with an AV? We have no idea. And we have to count on the kindness of the vendor to one, tell us that they're in our environment, how many vehicles they have in our environment, and where they're operating. And we've been able to have that conversation, but I think when you look at planning your mobility throughout your region, it's important to know to Rachel's point, there is a concern amongst them because they are startup companies and they are worried about what their investors think. But this is just really about making sure that we coexist well. And so I would say when you look at the regulatory environment, just having basic data like that, I mean, of course, we love things like origin and destination points as well, but I'm not going to get too aggressive about it. I'm baby steps, right? I'll just take that basic information, at least for the Texas environment.
Yeah, and I think again I can echo some of those points, but just bring them to the California context. So here I would say that the two most kind of elemental, kind of common sense regulatory gaps would be one, enforcement, just as Rachel was mentioning. You can give AV tickets for violating traffic laws. And so that seems to be something that needs to be urgently corrected. And then the other one is kind of on the data side in terms of reporting and transparency. Here, AV providers have to submit data to the DMV and to the PUC. But for instance, under their testing permits to the DMV, they have to submit, again, a wealth of data. But once they make it to deployment, so basically once they're ready to travel with passengers for a fare and they're ready to scale operations from a few vehicles to tens, hundreds of vehicles, then they're not required to submit any data to the DMV. So that really kind of makes no sense. And I think that's a kind of easy, kind of common sense kind of fix. But AVs also don't report, again, critical kind of information like their total BMT within, again, a city, within a county. So it's really hard to even understand the scale of operations at a more local level. We just have BMT at a statewide level. And then on top of all of these layers of all the data that is actually reported to the regulators, only a few, like some of that data is actually made public, and it's made public with a number of redactions. So what is actually made available to the public is, again, very limited, and one cannot really do much in terms of analysis or in terms of leveraging that data. So yeah, I guess what can we do? Like there's a couple of bills right now in the California legislature that are trying to address these gaps and kind of try to make these common sense improvements kind of codified in California law. But just kind of building on kind of like some of the questions about perhaps assessing providers' capabilities, right? Like how do we kind of like, what is this data for? I guess, again, certainly some of the issues that we have faced in San Francisco point that there are gaps in terms of how we determine, or how the system, right? I should not use the we in this case, how the system determines who's fit to operate or not. And so I think that, for instance, like we sent a number of kind of letters to the PUC, the California Public Utilities Commission, over the last years rather, kind of pointing at a series of kind of like events that were of concern, and that kind of pointed that, for instance, Cruise was not ready for a full-scale deployment. And so, again, I guess it isn't clear really how our regulators are taking in this data, how they make their assessments. So I guess it's hard to actually speak to how to improve that part of the system. I would just go back to the point about transparency being kind of like a foundational element to improving the outcomes as a whole. And again, that's why, again, we kind of are kind of like making data improvements a priority. So I think, yeah, I mentioned kind of like some basic improvements, like expansion to deployment here in the context of California. I would say that the crash reports themselves, and Rachel was pointing to the, I guess, the SGO data and how it could be improved. But there's also, for instance, the SGO kind of crash report is not even the definition of a crash is different between the California DMV and NHTSA, and so better aligning those could be another important step, and also making some improvements on how what's reported in terms of kind of location and kind of other permit information, I think would be very important. I think another piece is that we just don't want to, and I think again Rachel was speaking to, is that we don't want to just look at crash data, because at the end that's more of a lagging indicator of kind of safety performance. We would also like to be able to look into more leading indicators that allow us to take actions upstream before something much more severe were to happen. And so again, we're thinking about all of those instances of obstructions of the road, be it first responders or transit vehicles or general traffic lanes. We're also thinking about, again, traffic violations and all of these different things as giving us kind of like the yellow flags that something might need a fix or consideration before kind of services are advanced. And I guess the final point is on VMT, as kind of, I think Rachel was mentioning as well, which is that not only do we need this raw data, but we also need a tool to normalize the data. And so VMT being the more natural way of doing so. And so again, needing VMT at the local level to really be able to relate, again, the events to the specific geography in which they happen, and at times also kind of permit information to, again, even more clearly aligning the event with the specific kind of VMT that underlies it.
Yeah, thanks so much for the insights. So we are now 50 minutes into the webinar. So I would like to remind the participants, if you have any questions, you can either raise your hands to unmute yourself. We will unmute you, or you can request unmute. There's a button there, you can find it out, but maybe raising hands is the easiest. Or you can using the Q&A function to raise questions. I have one question now. I will ask Rachel particular. This is actually the thing we discussed before, but I will wait for other questions as we continue. So here's a questions for Rachel. How collaborative or willing to cooperate are those AV companies for those operating in your environment? I guess maybe sharing the data or any perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question we get a lot, and it really changes over time based on what's in the news, based on who's being investigated by NHTSA, right? You know, we have definitely experienced uncollaborative to collaborative partnerships, and we just keep trying and putting ourselves out there as partners. But we have to, you know, like, we are the city, and when we have problems, we can't like dance around them. Like, we are really clear about our needs. And I actually think that that's a really gift that we give people in this relationship, is like, these are our needs. Here's our clear set of expectations that we write for you. And like, it's really on the AV companies to meet those expectations, because we don't exist in a regulatory environment. So, you know, like, our relationship with the AV companies, I hope, is good. I do think it changes over time, depending on like who wants what, when, you know, like when the dashboard's updated and someone's incident makes it on there, they're often unhappy with that. And then, you know, there's something else will happen. So like all relationships, it goes up and down. But I do think that we've had a lot of luck with having more collaborative relationships with folks, just because we've been really open about our expectations, and we really want people to come to Austin and like learn about how we're doing things and like be a part of our mobility.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Rachel. So since I don't see any questions, nobody raising hands, I will finish my questions. That's the one that I really want to ask. I don't want to miss this one. So we have been, you know, following the regulatory environment question, right? So it's kind of, it's a little difficult at this point, right, to completely regulate what's happening. However, I think, it's been deployed, it's been expanded. Cities got to do something. We've been talking about permits. In California, there's some permits, but it's from COPC and DME perspective. Then data we talked about. Rachel, early on, you mentioned some geofencing or time of day requirement, right? That is something cities can do. I feel even to me is a traffic control kind of concept. And then any other things, right? This to me is a policy mechanisms, right? Policy levers the city can do now. I think if you can share some ideas on that perspective, what cities can do now to really facilitate, ensure system safety. Now, this is more of a regulatory, but the cities can do now is also from an infrastructure perspective, because all of you guys are, transit operators or infrastructure owners and operators. I've heard incidents where people come to cities request, how can you change your infrastructure or restriping your roadways, so that my AVs can operate safely on your roadways. I've heard discussions on that. What do you think? But I feel like there an MUTC, manual uniform traffic control devices, they've been doing work how AVs interacting with their traditional traffic control devices for humans, right? There's a lot of things going on that as infrastructure owners or operators or cities can do other than the regulatory environment, right? Both aspects, policy mechanisms or kind of infrastructure side, what can be done now for cities to ensure system safety. Any of you want to start?
I'll just add or start with and this is what I find on the public transit side, because we are moving people and it's a large group of people using AVs. I think it's very important that we develop relationships and partnerships with the private sector. The technology is coming, it's here, it's going to happen. And so I think the more that we're talking and working together, it improves safety for all of us, because at the end of the day, I know more about your end user than you do, right? You're a technology company, maybe a car builder, but we move people. That's who we know. And so I think the more we work together and understand each other, it improves the experience for both of us. You know how we operate and how to operate around us safely and vice versa. And so I think this in Texas is different from California. We have little to no regulations. And so we're not able to institute a lot of the safety checkpoints that Jean-Paul has, which is why it's really important for us to have those relationships and connections, because they don't have to go through us at all, but they do because of the relationship.
Yeah, I would just say that like there aren't that many safety checkpoints. I mean, I guess that on the regulators, I'm sure they do. There's the kind of requirements in terms of safety, but I guess just speaking, going back to your point, Kim, like us as a city, kind of like our perspective is very particular, right? And like and our expertise being how to manage a city network, and so part of kind of like the one of the ideas that I think that's our contribution maybe to actually answer the question is just putting ideas out there and having a public debate. Like I think again, transparency and openness about what we think of what we like is the best that we can do given the lack of tangible tools. And we're hoping that through debate and conversations and again partnerships, we can all kind of like elevate the outcomes as we move along. So for instance, our perspective has been for a long time that deployments should be more incremental and performance-based. That's an idea that we've been kind of pitching for a long time to our regulators here in California. So rather than just have kind of like a provider kind of sweeping into a city, as I think you were describing, crews coming, for instance, and suddenly like some of these very dense neighborhoods without much of any awareness to anyone, like setting up like a structure that actually allows for more of, again, tangible kind of like discernible incremental steps where perhaps operations begin in areas where the impacts are less, where the city is not as complex in terms of its operations. And once kind of the provider demonstrates the skill to operate well within those boundaries, then being allowed to kind of move into more complex areas of the city. And that also is not only for the provider's sakes in terms of, again, like gaining the experience to operate efficiently, but also for the city itself to actually better understand how to work with that provider and or AVs at large, and being able to bring them into, again, these more complex areas once kind of like some of the kinks have been figured out. And so that's, again, an idea that we kind of have been advocating for a while. And I think, again, that's perhaps another kind of tool. Again, we don't have any, I would just kind of push back on that notion, Yachi, that there's that much in terms of tools or things that we can do. Sure, like we can be very proactive in terms of, again, like pushing kind of like emergency alerts and kind of like trying to collaborate with providers. But I think that cities are in a really tough spot in terms of dealing with what is a rather unique new modality. Like I think we were just talking about TNCs, or maybe one can kind of think about micromobility as another example. But the level of innovation and the potential impact that the AVs bring is I think is kind of like a whole new generation. And so we need not only the tools and the lessons applied from that kind of those generations of improvements, but really bringing in a new set of tools. And unfortunately, like we're very, very, very limited in what we can do.
Yeah, and they both said it so well, but I'll just add, like, we've got a lot of these level 2 and level 3 SAE, level 2 and level 3 ADAS, and more of them coming all the time. So we have the opportunity to create the infrastructure of the future, which is really connected, where vehicles are talking to infrastructure and infrastructure is talking to vehicles. And AVs, I think, are really like a kind of accelerant on that. And, whether it's like smart infrastructure or something as easy as our lines and our striping and things like that, thinking about how to make infrastructure work for our transit, right? Because I mean, obviously buses and have a ton of really cool tech on them, can interact with the signals. Our fire trucks, right, have signal prioritization. So we've got this like whole mobility environment that we can make smarter and add things to, and that's expensive. And that is, but it has the opportunity to save a lot of lives, and it has the opportunity to move people around more sustainably. So we're working on, how we approach infrastructure in a city that has a lot of autonomous vehicles, how we approach infrastructure in a city that has a lot of connected vehicles, and how we make it work, for everyone using the right-of-way transit, vulnerable road users, our first responders, everyone. So I do think, beyond MUTCD Chapter 5, which is just a guideline, even how we do our LED signals, how like AVs are picking them up is a really big topic. So there's just a lot of opportunity to build some really cool stuff with our AV partners if they want to be our partners.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. And I'm glad you brought up the Connect vehicle, the V2X aspects, smart infrastructure. This is the whole topic of another webinar. We'll come back and revisit that topic. Right, we are right on time now. I don't see any questions. So thanks so much for joining us, for the audience. And also, I really appreciate the panelists share your insights. I will get back to you because we will do a kind of summary write-up, a white paper for our conversations today. So I'm making sure that I wrote everything clearly, reflect your ideas. All right, thanks so much. And for everyone, stay tuned for our next COE webinar. Thank you. Have a good day.